Welcome to the White Free Press Podcast. Today's narrated article, The Conceptual Failures of White Advocacy Leadership, A Century of Strategic Missteps. For a century, from 1925 to 2025, the white supremacist movement has sought to champion white heritage, racial realism, and cultural preservation. Leaders have ignited fervent followers with impassioned rhetoric and bold actions, rallying whites to resist demographic decline and anti-white forces. Yet their efforts have remained confined to the margins. They have failed to reshape the political or cultural landscape. This persistent failure stems from a flawed leadership model. Leaders prioritized individual prominence over collective progress. They neglected the need for broad-based white mobilization. They rejected integration into established political systems. Instead of forging a unified front within mainstream parties, these leaders pursued fragmented, theatrical campaigns. Those campaigns lacked professional appeal and tangible incentives. They left the movement vulnerable to systemic opposition. The movement has never built the cohesion, institutional engagement, or motivational alignment needed to advance white advocacy effectively. Ego-driven ambition over collective unity. At the core of white supremacist leadership's failure lies a fixation on personal aggrandizement rather than collective achievement. Leaders sought to become iconic figures. They delivered fiery speeches. They staged dramatic acts to cement their status as champions of white identity. This ego-driven approach fostered a proliferation of independent organizations. Each vied for supremacy within the movement rather than uniting under a shared vision. The resulting fragmentation appeared in internal rivalries and public scandals. It prevented the formation of a cohesive force capable of challenging anti-white narratives. Without a centralized strategy, these leaders squandered opportunities to amplify white solidarity. Their efforts dissipated into isolated factions. The absence of a unified agenda, driven by competing desires for leadership, left the movement splintered. It could not counter the coordinated momentum of opposing groups. Those groups leveraged institutional support to dominate cultural discourse. Absence of perceived white oppression. A critical barrier to the movement's success was the lack of widespread perception among whites that they faced existential oppression. Minority groups rallied around narratives of historical injustice and economic disparity. Whites historically viewed themselves as dominant, not threatened. Leaders attempted to stoke fears of cultural erosion or demographic replacement. These warnings failed to resonate with a broader white populace comfortable in their societal position. The theatrical zeal of their campaigns appeared contrived. Provocative stunts and inflammatory rhetoric alienated potential supporters. Those supporters saw no urgent need for radical action. Anti-white movements capitalized on compelling stories of systemic victimization. They united their bases with promises of restitution and empowerment. This motivational gap left white advocacy as a niche pursuit. It could not galvanize the mass support needed to rival the mainstream traction of adversaries. Those adversaries thrived on narratives of struggle and redemption. Rejection of political integration. The movement's leaders consistently eschewed integration into established political parties. They opted for outsider tactics that isolated them from mainstream influence, infiltrating both major parties, Republican and Democratic, to shape national policy held theoretical potential. Leaders rejected this path. They viewed party structures as compromised by anti-white agendas. Attempts to engage politically showed promise at times. Overt racial rhetoric triggered swift rejection from party elites. The refusal to adopt subtler messaging or build coalitions within existing systems limited access to voter bases, funding, and institutional legitimacy. Anti-white groups embedded their narratives within party platforms. They secured electoral power and policy influence through strategic alliances. The white supremacist movement insisted on independent, confrontational approaches. Rallies, violence, and propaganda prioritized ideological purity over pragmatic engagement. This ensured their relegation to the fringes of political discourse. Lack of professional appeal and economic incentives. White supremacist leadership suffered from a profound lack of professional appeal. They projected images of extremism or deviance that repelled mainstream whites. Campaigns steeped in provocative symbolism or criminality contrasted with the polished operations of anti-white organizations. Those organizations benefited from robust funding and institutional backing. The movement failed to offer tangible economic incentives. Wealth-building programs or job opportunities could have attracted pragmatic whites. Anti-white groups promised financial restitution and equity. They motivated supporters with clear material benefits. White advocates offered only ideological victories like racial pride or separatism. This absence of economic motivation, coupled with a lack of professional presentation, limited the movement's appeal to a narrow, radicalized base. It could not compete with the well-resourced, mainstream integrated efforts of opponents. Those opponents dominated cultural and policy arenas. Aggressive haste over strategic patience. The movement's leaders pursued quick, aggressive victories through militant actions or public spectacles. They neglected the patient, strategic approach needed for lasting impact. Haste appeared in violent campaigns, high-profile stunts, and inflammatory broadcasts. These aimed to shock and mobilize but often backfired. They invited legal repercussions and public condemnation. Building coalitions within political parties could gradually influence national direction. Leaders overlooked this in favor of immediate, confrontational wins. Anti-white movements adopted a long-term strategy. They infiltrated institutions and mobilized voters. They embedded agendas into societal structures over decades. The white supremacist movement's impatience sacrificed foresight. It left efforts as fleeting outbursts rather than transformative campaigns. Power dynamics and motivational deficits. The movement failed to frame whites as fighting for power rather than defending it. This undermined momentum. Anti-white groups positioned themselves as challengers to an oppressive white establishment. They galvanized supporters with a narrative of power acquisition. Whites, perceived as holding societal dominance, lacked comparable drive. They viewed their position as secure rather than under threat. Leaders manufactured urgency through apocalyptic rhetoric or radical calls to action. These failed to inspire mass engagement. They appeared theatrical rather than authentic. The absence of a compelling power-driven narrative, combined with fragmented leadership and insufficient economic incentives, kept white advocacy peripheral. It could not match the cohesive, motivational strength of anti-white forces. Those forces reshaped cultural and political landscapes. Conclusion. The white supremacist movement's century-long struggle, from 1925 to 2025, reveals a persistent failure to transcend marginal status. Leadership exalted individual prominence over collective progress. Leaders prioritized ego-driven spectacles. They rejected political integration. They failed to cultivate professional appeal or economic incentives. They squandered opportunities to rally whites against anti-white forces. The lack of perceived oppression among whites, aggressive haste, and a deficient power narrative left the movement fragmented and ineffective. It could not counter the institutional dominance of opposing groups. Unifying factions within mainstream parties while maintaining distinct platforms remains unrealized. Strategic cohesion and motivational alignment are essential to elevate white advocacy from the fringes to a transformative force in defense of racial heritage. Thank you for listening to the narrated article, The Conceptual Failures of White Advocacy Leadership, a Century of Strategic Missteps on the White Free Press podcast. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, and visit whitefreepress.com for more content. See you next time on the White Free Press podcast.